The interesting thing about the ESEE Lite Machete is that it's almost the exact opposite of the Iranian gigantic cleaver that I just had a video on. The cleaver was very short, exceptionally heavy, and relatively thick blade stock. So you had to use it to be effective and efficient, rather short, slow, heavy, and more push type chopping. As you can see, the ESEE Lite Machete is very thin, so it has no ability to pry out chips, and because it's so thin, it also doesn't tend to wedge out chips as you're cutting, so you have to cut much more narrow notches when you're working the wood. Because it's a much longer blade, you can also get much more benefit from snap or rotational cuts. So I'm doing a lot more rotation and much less of a push cut using the ESEE Lite Machete compared to how I was using the Iranian gigantic cleaver. And it's kind of interesting working with both of them on this wood because they're almost complete opposites. Neither one of them I would describe as optimal, but it's kind of interesting just to explore the difference in range and technique. The other thing that I found, which I didn't expect right away, is that on very windy days, and it gets really kind of windy here, over 100 kilometers an hour, the wind actually pushes the blade, and you can feel the blade being pushed in the swing. And if you look at the blade, even in the videos, you can see that the blade is actually not remaining 100% perfectly straight in the actual swing itself. So that kind of movement, especially when it goes into wood, is causing you to lose some precision and accuracy because the blade is actually moving in the swing, and it sets off a lot of the vibrations in the wood. So just be aware of that. But still, very interesting blade to work with this because you have to cut with it so differently than the Iranian gigantic cleaver. This is an old table leg. It's probably about the limit of the kind of wood that you want to try to cut with the light machete, unless you regrind it. The penetration is low. It's setting off a lot of vibration in the blade, and you're just losing a lot of energy going everywhere except where you want it to be, which is into the wood. Now the interesting thing here, great thing about working on stock pieces of lumber, is that you compare across different blades decently well. Lots of variations in wood, but still. So I know that Mike's Excalibur cuts this very easily in 3 hits, and on a decent piece of wood with a decent swing, I can get it in 1 hit, no problem. The ESEE Lite Machete does it in 3 most of the time, and on sometimes will go up to about 5. So it's a step down from the Excalibur and lots of other blades in that class. But the interesting thing is that it's not really that much when you consider how light this blade is and the advantages of that. So if you look at it in terms of performance by weighting, it actually does relatively well. And again, it's basically only 1 step behind. You're looking at the ESEE Lite Machete goes 3 most of the time, sometimes has to go 5. And Excalibur can do it on 1 on a really good hit, but easily does it on 3. So definitely competitive, especially when you look at it in terms of performance for weight. This is the downside, though, of using these types of machetes on this type of wood. You can see the edge can get bent up rather easily. Again, these machetes often have variable edge grinds, This one goes down to around 8 degrees per side up through the tip. So take into consideration again that's an 8 degree per side bevel, but you can see how it's rather easy to have the edge sort of dent and deform on harder woods, especially around knots. But again, 8 degrees per side now. Now this is obviously where the ESEE Lite Machete was made to be used. It's where it excels, and this type of work, it's clearly ahead of knives like Mike's Excalibur. There's no real advantage to having a much heavier knife. This wood is small, it's relatively easy to cut, and the fatigue rate's very low with a blade as light as this. And it just cuts through these essentially all day long. Now, I'm not going anywhere near full effort here. This is sped up, obviously, because I was at this for quite a while, so I'm just cutting out a few clips. But I'm trying to avoid jamming a knife directly down into the ground, so I'm trying to use minimal force, and I'd rather do 5 light cuts than 1 heavy cut, because the fatigue rate is much lower. But the ESEE Lite Machete is really nice for this. Plus, it's a relatively inexpensive machete. So if you do bash the blade into the ground, it's no big deal. You just take out a file and you sharpen it. No real big concerns. This is, however, where it really starts to excel. Cleaning these limbs off, cutting off the tops of the trees, it just works very well. It completely outclasses the cleaver, which is very clumsy on this type of work. ESEE Lite Machete has no issues. Easily clears these branches off, many branches in one swing. Easily takes the limbs off, and the fatigue rate on this is very, very low. Literally do this all day long with no concern. And here's where the very low angle on the tip really well suits it. Shears through this with no issues whatsoever. It was very interesting to cut this wood with the ESEE Lite Machete, especially after just doing a similar rather large amount of it with the Aranyik Gigantic Cleaver. Because if you had asked me before I had done this comparison which one of the two blades would I have used, I would have picked the ESEE Lite Machete without much hesitation. But what I found after experimenting a bit with the Gigantic Cleaver was if I used a very slow pace and heavy short chops, the fatigue rate was quite low. It could cut through all this wood with about 1 hit and had no sticking or binding and was very fluid. The ESEE Lite Machete could cut through the majority of it with about 1 hit, the hard piece right there, and the wood was flexing under the machete as I was cutting it. However, I had to make the cut power much more precise. If I over penetrated, the machete would tend to stick into the block below. Again, the angle of this machete is relatively low. It's around 8 to 10 degrees in the region where I'm cutting most of this wood. So we'll stick into that piece of spruce I got underneath it relatively easy. So I was having to be more particular, more focused about the cutting, which is not a bad thing. But in general, the cleaver was, again, if I'm not doing any kind of testing or evaluation, I would probably pick it to do this work, which is kind of surprising. But the ESEE Lite Machete does this very well, and the fatigue rate is essentially non-existent and can chop through, significantly sized pieces. This is all relatively soft wood. It's mainly alder. But still, very nice to work with. And it's one of the very few smooth handles that I actually like to work with. Now, the reason why I'm okay with and actually rather like the handle being smooth on this, I found is because of how light I'm actually using the machete. It's relatively pointless to try to put a tremendous amount of power into this blade, because if you over penetrate, the machete will just bind or stick into wood. So you have to use a lot of light cuts rather than a few really heavy cuts. Well, when you're only swinging the machete very light, you don't need a very heavy grip on the blade. You have a relatively light grip, and again, you're not swinging the blade relatively hard, you don't need to be that concerned about little bits of slippage. And the other thing that I found is you pretty much have to expect that this machete is going to move, because as I noted before, even the wind will blow it. So again, trying to be overly precise about controlling the blade isn't really that productive anyway. So a little bit of slippage on the hand, it's not that big of a deal. So a smooth handle for this works relatively well. I do find the handle to be a little bit boxy though, so it's not absolutely perfect, but I mean you're talking about basically like a 4 out of 5 type deal. And that is a bad handle, but if it was just a bit more rounded, instead of being a bit more rectangular, it'd almost be coming close to being what perfect would be. I still think I'd enjoy a little bit of texture, but I think I'm a bit biased in that regard, just because I do so much work with textured grips. Now this is what you think, right? When someone says light machete work, high, deep, relatively thick green vegetation. So this is an old tree at the end of a driveway, really heavy ingrowth, was obstructing vision of the driveway and coming into it, and it was right at the end of a turn section. So trying to clean all this up and trim off some of these old dead insect infested branches. Now I'm trying to avoid cutting into the main trunk of the tree as I'm doing this, because again this is more like pruning rather than felling. So I'm doing a lot of light taps, so 10 light taps rather than one quick cut. Now you could make an argument here that a small flex blade, like a Mora or similar, would be much nicer because you just take those small branches, put them under tension, and press through it, no issue. And even anvil pruners would be nicer for a lot of these branches, and a small, decent saw, much better for pruning, no issue. I'm using the machete simply because I like to use the machete. And to cut all this green vegetation, machete is much better than trying to use a pair of pruners. But of course, if you have a few tools with you, the machete and a small saw and pruners would be the most efficient set to use here. But a machete does this well, and it's a clear example of work where this is far more optimal than something like the Iranian gigantic cleaver. And the cleaver is just very difficult to work here. It's relatively short, so cleaning away this green vegetation, which is trivial with the machete, is very difficult with the cleaver. Now, something like Mike's Excalibur has the same reach as the ESEE light machete, so it can easily handle this green vegetation. This is only about a half hour's work of sort of poking around, so it's not like even though the Excalibur is heavier, the fatigue rate is not going to be significant because again it's only a half hour's worth of work. But there's no real advantage to using the Excalibur. It's not any better at this work than the ESEE light machete is. And the thing is that you're going to be banging the machete into rocks. Unless you carefully check every square inch of this ground, there's going to be things in it. And a couple of times in this, I power slammed the edge of this right into a great big rock. So what? A couple of minutes with a file at the end of all this work, and it's back to new. And if you do use machete relatively heavily, you're still looking at a long, long time before you ever wear it out. It's relatively uncommon to do it. And again, so I'm trying to sort of get all this dead wood out of the way without doing that much damage to the main trunk of the tree. So it's a lot of little tiny cuts rather than a few big ones. Looks much better now. So now I want to clear up all these branches, just trimming off the slight stock. That's all in a pile. I'll just burn that relatively shortly. Then the thicker main part of the branch I'll just separate out, and I can do some test cutting on that, and that's actually heavy enough that I'll actually burn inside in a wood stove. And this, again, ESEE light machete just does this relatively well. I'd take it over the Excalibur and definitely the gigantic cleaver for this type of work. Because you're doing just lots of little tiny light cuts, and especially because the angle of this is rather light up in the tip where I'm sweeping most of this off, again it's around 8 degrees per side, it just cuts through it relatively easy. Now, Mike's Excalibur is pretty good at it, much better than the gigantic cleaver, no issues, but ESEE light machete does it relatively well and is much lighter in hand. And of course, this is where it really excels, just cutting through all this vegetation, the green stuff, easily, and then cutting down some of these relatively small alders and other softwoods that are in the way, and just really cleaning up this area. And again, just clearing some of the limbs off of the last few branches. Now, a lot of people think you can't cut thicker wood with a machete, especially a light machete. That's simply nonsensical. Again, you want to pay attention to how the machete is ground. You can see that I'm working closer to the handle. This wood is relatively punky on the outside, so it's a bit soft, but some parts of the inside are rather dry. So I'm trying to work backwards on the blade, so I'm not up to the part of the edge that's around 8 degrees per side. I'm drifting back a little bit to the parts that are around 10 to 11 degrees per side. And that's easy enough to handle this wood. The biggest issue with this machete, cutting thicker woods, is over penetration. So what you want to do, which I'm not actually doing relatively well, is that your first cut should be rather soft, because you can see how free the machete is on the second cut. See, sticks a little bit, perfectly free. Once you start getting into the wood, the machete will be free. It only sticks a little bit like that when you make your initial cut into wood that has no actually wedge in that area or notch. So what you want to do is make your first cuts kind of light, and then once the wedge gets going and the machete starts moving freely, then you can ramp up your power. But again, I'm not doing a lot of this type of wood cutting. Like, I'm only cutting about 50 pieces of wood here with the machete, so I'm not really that concerned about fatigue. If you had to do it for a long period of time, though, that's the kind of technique that you would use. A little bit of a knot there, so that's not going to clear out, and you can see the machete can't pry it out, so just haul it out of the way and keep on going. So yeah, can you use machetes, even light machetes, to cut wood? Yeah, no issues. Are they as effective as your thicker sort of Golocks and Parangs? No. I mean, this machete, not only is it lighter, so you can't generate as much power, the machete will move in the wind, which lowers your penetration and your accuracy and your precision, but it's also vibrating quite a lot when it impacts the wood, and that vibration means that that's energy being lost through the blade shaking rather than going into the wood. But they can be much more functional than shorter, stouter blades, your sort of tactical style blades at chopping large wood. And they're relatively decent enough that unless you're working on relatively thick woods, it's usually not a problem. So here's a smaller piece of wood that's significantly harder. It's probably about the largest piece of wood that you'd be cutting for most shelter type construction. And no issues with the machete cutting it. The violent ringing that you hear, again, it's just the vibration of the blade. And the only time you want to use really maximum force is sort of like that at the end, where you know you can cut through. If you impact it with that much force while you're doing the cutting, you'd probably bind or stick the blade in the wood. But again, no issues. You can easily cut thicker woods with machetes. Again, the main thing to look out for is how the machetes are ground. Some of these machetes, in fact quite a lot of them, have varying edge grinds, and the edge can get up to around 6 to 8 degrees per side, or as low as 6 to 8 degrees per side. So you either want to avoid using the tip or only use the tip on relatively clear woods, or use it and just be prepared for the fact that it might dent or roll relatively easily. So here's a piece of wood that's softer than the last piece, but not punky like the first piece. And I'm experimenting a little bit with using more force in the cuts to see the fewest number of chops that I can cut through some of this wood with. But basically I'm finding it's generally not that productive, especially on your opening hits, because while you can get very strong penetration, the blade will tend to stick. So your best bet is to go relatively light with the first hits, and then use your power cuts to open up the notches. But if you look at the ESEE Lite Machete in terms of something like Mike's Excalibur, the Excalibur can get more power and still remain fluid, so no issue. And I mean, that's why you have things like harangues and golocks and bolos. They're made to cut wood like this, and they generally do it a bit better than light machetes. Again, more power, and they can be more fluid. However, the ESEE Lite Machete is probably more effective doing this type of work than a lot of your sort of Bowies and sort of generic type knives that people often use for this type of work. So no, it's not going to outproduce a decently made Golock, because this is what Golocks are made for, similar to prangs and bolos. But can probably do a lot better, and definitely a lot better than some of the 6 to 7 inch knives that people often carry for this type of work. And again, your ideal technique, which I'm not doing very well here, is you go in relatively light, then heavy like that. Relatively light, then heavy. And that way you can keep a relatively fluid pace. And once the wood starts releasing evenly, then you can go heavy all the way around, and you keep the blade relatively fluid. But again, I'm only doing a very tiny amount of work here, probably about 50 sections of wood, so there's no issue with fatigue no matter what way I cut with the blade. But if it was longer, I mean, if I had lots of this wood to cut up, then I'd be a lot more focused on where I was putting power into the cuts. All I'm trying to do now is just get my penetration down, so and get my precision, so I get cuts where I want to cut them. Now, I have a whole video on doing this work with the ESEE Lite Machete on a request to do some harder or more abusive work from Randall. This is very hardwood and it's very small diameter, so you have a lot of force into a small area on the edge, so it generates relatively high pressure. And again, the edge angle here is around 8 degrees per side, so a lot of pressure on a very small edge angle. And because this wood is breaking and twisting and doing everything besides being cleanly cut, you're getting a lot of torques. That's what you're supposed to do. Use the spine of the blade and just crack all this off. But again, this is intentionally abusive work. So what's happening is that the edge is actually denting and rolling with every impact. That was not a nice one right there. So I mean, the edge should be able to cut wood off in one hit, but it's turning and rolling, and you can actually see a relatively big dent at that point. So it's switching to smashing these off relatively clearly. And again, I have a whole video on this in detail. Just wanted to put a small clip of it here. But after all that, rock impacts, very hard wood, dents, twists in the edge, couple minutes with a file, and this is good to go again. That's how proper machetes should be when they're made from the right steels and hardened properly.